The night was calm, almost too calm for what was about to unfold. The quiet hum of hospital machines was suddenly drowned out by the thunderous roar of engines, hundreds of them. Nurses rushed to the windows, patients peeked from their rooms, and within moments, the front entrance of St. Mary's Hospital was surrounded by 250 bikers dressed in leather jackets, their headlights cutting through the darkness like fireflies in formation. At the center of it all was a girl named Emily, a fragile 15-year-old whose world had been shattered by the man who was supposed to protect her. Emily had been brought to the hospital late that night, her face bruised, her ribs cracked. Her stepfather, a man named Rick, had always been cruel, but this time, he nearly took her life. The police arrested him briefly, but due to a loophole in the system, he was released within hours. Word spread fast through the small town, but it reached one group that refused to let this injustice pass unnoticed, the Iron Shields Motorcycle Club. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Mason, had once been in Emily's position. Years ago, he too had suffered under an abusive father. When he heard about the girl in the hospital and how her abuser was walking free, something inside him snapped. "No one touches a kid again," he growled to his brothers. Within an hour, every member had mounted their bikes, ready to stand between Emily and the monster who wanted her silenced. As the engines thundered into the night, the hospital staff grew nervous. The security guard at the gate trembled as he saw the endless line of headlights approaching. The bikers parked in formation, blocking every entrance. Mason stepped off his bike, walked up to the security guard, and said in a calm, steady voice, "We're not here to start trouble. We're here to make sure she's safe." The guard nodded, sensing the sincerity in his tone. Inside, Emily was sitting in her hospital bed, trembling, tears running down her bruised cheeks. When she heard the distant rumble of engines, fear gripped her heart. She thought he had come back for her. But then, the door opened gently, and a nurse whispered, "Emily, there's someone here who wants to make sure you're never hurt again." Mason walked in slowly, removing his helmet. His eyes softened as he looked at the broken girl before him. "Hey, kid," he said gently, "you're safe now. No one's gonna hurt you again. Not while we're around." Emily didn't speak. She just stared, confused, then broke into tears. Mason knelt beside her bed, holding her hand as she sobbed. Outside, the bikers formed a human wall. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their tattoos glistening under the hospital lights. Word spread across social media within minutes. People from across the city began gathering near the hospital, some bringing food, others bringing blankets for the bikers. Within hours, #IronShields trended online, though Mason never cared for fame. He only cared that one little girl would finally sleep without fear. But Rick wasn't done. Fueled by rage and humiliation, he arrived at the hospital around midnight, drunk and shouting her name. He tried to push through the crowd, but the moment he did, 50 bikers surrounded him. Mason stepped forward. "You lay a hand on her again," he said in a voice that made the air go still, "and you'll have to go through every one of us first." Rick tried to fight back, but the police, alerted by the crowd, arrived just in time. This time, the evidence and the witnesses were enough. He was handcuffed and taken away, screaming. As the squad car disappeared into the distance, Emily peeked from her window. She saw the sea of leather jackets, the bikes gleaming under the hospital lights, and a banner one of them held, "Your family now." For the first time in years, she smiled. Over the next few months, the Iron Shields visited her often. They helped her move into a safe foster home. They bought her school supplies, fixed up her bike, and taught her to ride. Mason became the father figure she never had, showing her that strength doesn't come from fists, it comes from love, loyalty, and courage. Emily began speaking publicly about abuse, telling her story alongside Mason at biker charity events. The same girl who once hid in fear now stood tall before hundreds, saying, "When the world turned its back on me, 250 strangers showed up to protect me. They weren't just bikers, they were angels on wheels." Years later, Emily graduated from college with honors. The Iron Shields filled the audience, their engines roaring in celebration. Mason stood beside her as she received her diploma, tears welling in his eyes. "Told you, kid," he whispered. "You were born to rise." The story of Emily and the Iron Shields became a symbol of hope across the country. People began seeing bikers not as outlaws, but as protectors of the broken. And in every town they rode through, one message echoed from their engines: "No child stands alone." That night at St. Mary's Hospital was remembered as the moment when 250 bikers stormed not to fight, but to protect, to heal, and to prove that family isn't always blood, it's the people who show up when the world doesn't. Months had passed since that unforgettable night at St. Mary's Hospital, but for Emily, the sound of roaring engines still brought tears to her eyes, not of fear anymore, but of gratitude. Every weekend, Mason and the Iron Shields visited her. They'd roll up to her foster home, park their gleaming bikes in a perfect line, and call out, "You ready to ride, kid?" She'd run out laughing, her helmet already in hand. For the first time in her life, Emily felt free. No shouting, no fear, no pain. Just the open road and the wind in her hair. Mason had become more than a guardian, he was family. He and the club made sure she never felt alone again. But deep down, Emily still carried scars that no one could see. The nights were hardest. She'd wake up sweating from nightmares, hearing her stepfather's voice, feeling his shadow hovering over her. Mason knew that pain. He had lived it once. One night after a long ride, they sat by a campfire under the stars. The other bikers laughed and shared stories, but Mason noticed Emily staring into the flames, quiet and distant. "You okay, kid?" he asked softly. Emily hesitated. "I thought I was," she said, her voice trembling. "But I still see him in my dreams. I still feel small, weak." Mason leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're not weak. You're healing. The difference between the two is time." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small patch. It had the Iron Shield's emblem stitched in gold and black, a set of wings wrapped around a heart. "You've earned this," he said, handing it to her. "You're one of us now." The group went silent. No outsider had ever been patched in before. But as Mason helped her sew the emblem onto her jacket, every biker raised their hand in salute. From that night on, Emily wasn't just the girl they protected, she was Shield 251. But peace never lasts long when evil refuses to die. One morning, Mason received a call from a contact in the police department. Rick had escaped during a prison transfer. The news hit like a thunderclap. Emily was at school when Mason burst through the doors on his bike, panic written all over his face. "Get your things," he ordered. "We're leaving." Emily's hands shook as she packed her bag. The nightmares had come to life. By the time they reached the clubhouse, the bikers were already gathered, engines idling. Mason addressed them like a general before battle. "That man's out there, and he'll come for her. But he'll have to go through us first." The group roared in agreement. The Iron Shield spread out across the town, keeping watch on every road, alley, and parking lot. For days, they stood guard while Emily stayed hidden inside. Then, one night, it happened. A black car pulled up near the clubhouse, its headlights off. Mason saw the figure step out, and his heart sank. It was Rick. Before Mason could move, Rick smashed a bottle, shouting, "You think you can keep her from me? She's mine." The bikers rushed forward, forming a wall between him and the building. Mason approached slowly, his fists clenched but his voice steady. "You lost the right to call her yours the moment you hurt her." Rick lunged forward with the broken bottle, slashing the air. But before he could take another step, two bikers tackled him to the ground. The police arrived moments later, called by Emily herself. This time, Rick didn't go down yelling. He just stared at her as the officers cuffed him. Emily stood at the door, trembling, but this time, she didn't hide. "You can't hurt me anymore," she said quietly. "I'm not afraid of you. Not now, not ever." The Iron Shields cheered as the police car drove away. Mason walked up to Emily and put his hand on her shoulder. "You did it, kid. You faced your past." She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "No," she said softly, "we did." Months later, Emily began working with shelters for abused children. She used her own story to give others courage. With the help of the Iron Shields, she started a charity called Wings of Hope, offering support and protection to survivors of domestic violence. Mason helped her set up the first safe house, a small building with a bright red door. Above it, a sign read, "No fear beyond this point." The day the safe house opened, hundreds of bikers from across the country arrived to show support. Engines rumbled, people clapped, and Emily stood on stage with a microphone in her hand. "There was a time," she said, "when I thought no one cared. When I thought I'd never be safe again. But then they showed up. Not to fight, but to protect. They taught me that family isn't what you're born into, it's who stands by you when everything falls apart. As the crowd roared in applause, Mason smiled proudly. He looked at the girl who had once been broken and now stood stronger than steel. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of engines across the horizon. Emily turned to Mason and said, "Let's ride." And so they did, 2 generations of survivors leading a convoy of hope through the open road, proving to the world that no darkness is too deep when you have people who are willing to fight for your light. The story of the Iron Shields and the girl they protected became a legend, a reminder that true strength is not in fists or fear, but in unity, love, and the courage to rise again. Years later, the legend of the Iron Shields and the girl they once protected had spread across the country. Newspapers called it the night of 250 engines, but to Emily and Mason, it was simply the night everything changed, the night fear met its end. Emily was 22 now. Confident, brave, and unrecognizable from the terrified child she once was. Her charity, Wings of Hope, had grown into a national movement. Safe houses stood in 6 states, each run by volunteers, many of them former victims who'd found strength through her story. And always, at every opening ceremony, the deep rumble of motorcycle engines filled the air. The Iron Shields never left her side. But one summer afternoon, as Emily prepared for another rally in Phoenix, Mason received a letter that shook him to the core. It was from a small-town sheriff in Texas. Rick, Emily's stepfather, had been released again, this time under parole. He was sick, terminally ill, and claimed he wanted to make peace before dying. Mason didn't know whether to tell her. He sat in his workshop, staring at the letter, grease on his hands, heart heavy with dread. When Emily found out, she didn't react the way he expected. She didn't cry, she didn't yell. She just sat quietly for a moment, then said, "I need to see him." Mason was stunned. "You don't owe him that, kid." But Emily shook her head. "I'm not doing it for him. I'm doing it for me." The next morning, Mason and 3 other bikers rode with her to the hospice where Rick lay. The ride was silent, heavy with unspoken emotion. When they arrived, Emily hesitated at the door. "You sure?" Mason asked softly. She nodded. "I have too." Inside the dimly lit room, Rick lay weak and frail, tubes in his arms, his face pale. When he saw her, his eyes widened in disbelief. "Emily, you came," he whispered. She didn't move closer, but her voice was calm. "I came because I want you to hear this from me. You don't own me. You never did. What you did to me doesn't define who I am, it defines who you became. And I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." Tears rolled down Rick's face. For a moment, the monster she once feared looked like nothing more than a broken man. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Emily nodded once. "Then rest with that." She turned and walked out, her steps steady and strong. Mason followed, silent, proud beyond words. As they rode back, the sun began to set behind them, the road glowing gold. Emily felt lighter, like years of weight had finally lifted from her chest. "I think it's over," she said softly through the headset. Mason smiled under his helmet. "It's just beginning, kid. You're free now." Months later, Rick passed away quietly, leaving behind no family, no friends, only the memory of his cruelty. Emily attended no funeral, but she visited one of her safe houses that day. There, a little girl about 10 years old ran up to her and hugged her waist. "Miss Emily, are you an angel?" the girl asked. Emily knelt, smiling warmly. "No," she said, "but I once had a few angels on bikes looking after me." The girl giggled, and Emily looked out the window, where Mason and the other bikers waited, their engines humming softly. The same sound that once terrified her now felt like the heartbeat of safety itself. As years passed, Emily's organization became international. Mason retired from riding but stayed as the honorary head of the Iron Shields. He would often visit schools with Emily, talking about strength, kindness, and the power of standing together. The sight of a massive biker speaking gently to children always drew smiles, and tears. One autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mason sat on his porch, watching the sky burn orange. Emily arrived, holding 2 cups of coffee. They sat together in silence for a while. Then she said softly, "You saved me, Mason." He shook his head. "No, kid, you saved yourself. We just made sure you had the chance." A week later, Mason passed away peacefully in his sleep. The news spread quickly, and on the day of his funeral, something extraordinary happened. Thousands of bikers from across the country gathered, their engines rumbling in unison. As Emily stood before his casket, she looked out at the endless sea of riders and whispered, "You'll always ride with us." When the engines started again, the sound echoed for miles, a sound not of grief, but of honor. Years later, every time Emily led a charity ride, she left one space empty beside her. On her leather jacket, beneath the Iron Shield's patch, was a new emblem, a silver wing with Mason's initials engraved. And, when people asked her why she still rode, she would smile and say, "Because somewhere on the wind, I can still hear them. 250 engines, and one guardian angel riding beside me." The legend of the Iron Shields lived on, not as a story of vengeance but of transformation. They proved that even the roughest souls can carry the gentlest hearts, and that sometimes the loudest engines belong to the quietest heroes. Emily's journey from fear to freedom became a beacon of hope for countless others, reminding the world that courage isn't the absence of pain, it's the choice to rise above it, and ride forward, no matter how rough the road may be. Years later, Emily stood before hundreds at a charity ride, her voice steady, her eyes filled with peace. The girl who once hid in fear was now a symbol of courage and healing. As the engines of the Iron Shields roared behind her, she smiled and whispered, "You saved me when the world didn't care. Now it's my turn to save others." She put on her helmet, looked at the sky, and felt the wind brush her face, soft, warm, and familiar. Somewhere out there, she could almost hear Mason's voice saying, "Ride free, kid." The engines thundered to life, echoing across the horizon, not as a sound of rebellion but of hope. And with that, Emily led the convoy down the open road, carrying the legacy of 250 angels on wheels who once taught her that family isn't just who you're born to, it's who shows up when you need them most.